Greetings, I'm the man behind the mask, and I'd like to talk to you about hockey. Yes, let's talk about hockey, the show that journeys through the history of the sport of ice hockey from its disputed origins to the game we see today. Today, we conclude our look back at the founding years of the NHL's original 6 hockey clubs with the third American team to join the league in 1926, the Chicago Blackhawks.
The origin of this Chicago hockey club actually takes us back to the prairie lands of Canada in 1921, when the Western Canada Hockey League was formed. One of the 4 original teams in this new league was known as the Regina Capitals. Though this club would win the first WCHL league title in 1921-22 and finish as the runner-up to the title in the following 2 seasons, their 4th season would see them drop to dead last in the league with an 8-20-0 record. With the team now in debt and losing money from their plummet to the bottom, they decided to pick up and move south across the border to Portland, Oregon, where they played the 1925-26 season as the Portland Rosebuds. In Portland, they would improve to a 4th place finish in the now 6-team WHL. However, by the end of that first season in their new location, the WHL itself would fold, and the NHL would swoop in and buy the contract of every player from the WHL for $258,000. With this new influx of talent, the NHL expanded with 3 United States-based teams for the 1926-27 season, with the players from the former Portland club used to form the core of the new NHL franchise set for Chicago. The Chicago team's first owner was coffee tycoon Frederick McLaughlin, who outbid grain magnate James E. Norris for the franchise. A commander with the 333rd Machine Gun Battalion of the 86th Infantry Division during World War I, McLaughlin's unit was nicknamed the Black Hawk Division, after a Native American of the Sauk Nation, Chief Black Hawk, who was a prominent figure in the history of Illinois. So, to honor his old military unit, he decided to name his new team the Blackhawks. Additionally, McLaughlin's wife, Irene Castle, was the one to design the logo for the new team, which featured a crudely drawn black and white native head in a circle.
McLaughlin took a very active role in running the team, despite having no background in the sport, and for most of his tenure as owner, served as his own general manager. He was also very interested in promoting American hockey players, a rarity in professional hockey at the time, and it was under him that the Blackhawks would become the first NHL team with an All-American-born lineup.
The Hawks' first season would be a moderate success. They played their first game on November 17, 1926, against the Toronto St. Patrick's in Chicago Coliseum, winning the game by a score of 4-1, and ended up finishing the season ranked 3rd in the newly formed American Division of the NHL, earning them a berth in the playoffs for the first year that the NHL had exclusive control of the Stanley Cup. In the playoff quarterfinals that year, Chicago would be matched up with second-ranked Boston for a 2-game total goal series. Things would start off on the wrong foot for the Blackhawks, as they dropped the first game to Boston 6-1. Though they managed to tie the Bruins 4-4 in Game 2, Boston still outscored Chicago 10-5 over the 2 games, and thus won the series. The Blackhawks' success from their first season, however, did not carry over as they dropped to last place in the American Division in their second year and third year in the NHL. But their play would pick back up during the 1929-30 season as they finished second in the American Division and returned to the playoffs. Once again, though, it would be in and out for the Blackhawks as they fell to the Canadiens by a total goal score of 3-2 in the quarterfinals. Chicago would not only repeat their second-place finish in the American Division in 1930-31, but their top goal scorer Johnny Gottslieg, star defenseman Cy Wentworth, and goaltender Charlie Gardner, who had been named to the NHL's first-team All-Stars, would backstop them past the Maple Leafs and Rangers to face the Canadiens in a best-of-5 game series for the 1931 Stanley Cup. This series would be a very close affair, with it going the full 5 games, and each of those games being decided by only 1 goal. But in the end, Montreal's 2-1 victory in Game 5 had them in the winner's circle and not the Blackhawks. Though over the next 2 seasons, Chicago would lose to Toronto in the quarterfinals of the playoffs, then fail to make the playoffs after falling to the bottom of the American Division, their goaltender, Charlie Gardner, would still bring some recognition to the club, with a first-team All-Star selection and Vezina Trophy in 1932, and then a second-team All-Star selection in 1933. In 1933-34, Gardner would continue to gather accolades with another Vezina Trophy and joining his teammate Lionel Conacher with a first-team All-Star selection. As a team, Chicago would climb back to finish second in the American Division and make the playoffs. With Gardner at the top of his game, the Blackhawks would again make a hard run for the Stanley Cup, beating the Montreal Canadiens in the quarterfinals and then the Montreal Maroons in the semifinals to advance to the final round of the playoffs. Their opponent for this best-of-5 series would be the Detroit Red Wings. However, this time, Gardner would be too good for the opposition to handle, allowing only 1 goal in each of the first 2 games of the series, 2 in the third, and finally shutting Detroit out in Game 4, as Chicago winger Mush March netted the only goal of the game in double overtime to give the Blackhawks their first ever Stanley Cup title.
However, the Stanley Cup celebrations were cut short when Charlie Gardner's health took a turn for the worst. Having played with a tonsil infection for most of the 1933-34 season, Gardner was often slumped over his crossbar during game breaks, nearly blacking out. Then, during the summer after Chicago's Cup win, while on his way to a singing lesson, Gardner collapsed and went into a coma from which he never woke. Gardner died at age 29 on June 13, 1934 from a brain hemorrhage brought on by the infection.
Though Chicago had tragically lost their star goaltender and team captain, they took to the ice for the 1934-35 season determined to defend their hard-earned title. For the second year in a row, the Blackhawks would finish the season ranked second in the American Division. However, this time around, their playoff run would be quite short as they fell to the Montreal Maroons in the quarterfinals by a score of 1-0 over the 2-game series. Things would continue on a downward trend from there, as Chicago dropped to third in the American Division in 1935-36 and were once again eliminated in the quarterfinals of the playoffs. Then, in 1936-37, they dropped down in the standings again, this time to the bottom of their division, thus preventing them from qualifying for the playoffs. In 1937-38, their 14-25-9 record would barely be an improvement from the previous year, but it was good enough for them to just squeak into the 1938 playoffs. Once there, the Blackhawks would stun the Canadiens and then the Americans with overtime goals in the deciding games of both series, propelling them to the Stanley Cup Finals for the second time in 5 years. Here, they were matched against the Canadian Division's Toronto Maple Leafs, and right off the bat, the Blackhawks were at a disadvantage since their goaltender, Mike Caracas, couldn't play with his injured foot. Desperate for a goaltender, Chicago pulled minor leaguer Alfie Moore out of a Toronto bar and onto the ice. Moore would win the 1 game he played in, but when Chicago tried repeating that plan with another player in Game 2, it failed and Toronto tied the series. However, for Games 3 and 4, Caracas was fitted with a special skate to protect his injured foot, and was back in net for the Blackhawks, leading them to victory in both games and securing Chicago its second ever Stanley Cup. Interestingly enough, to this day, the 1938 Blackhawks possess the poorest regular season record of any Stanley Cup champion. In the years following their 1938 victory, the Blackhawks would struggle a bit more with their on-ice performance than some of the other original six clubs, but they would rise again as a contender come the 1960s and the decades that followed, bringing home 2 more Stanley Cups and a number of other NHL titles and trophies to the Windy City.
Game on!
Yeah, game on!